Hello class, I am Roy Tate. This discussion is about my research paper titled Lord Dunmore's Folly. History is interesting because we can look at the past and learn from it. Big decisions by important men have been studied for ages. My paper focuses on the November 7th, 1775 proclamation by John Murray, the Earl of Dunmore, while he was the royal governor of Virginia, and its impact on the Revolutionary War as a whole, and more specifically the people of Virginia. The paper starts with an overview of the events leading up to the Revolutionary War, such as the Stamp Act and the subsequent Stamp Act Congress, with its resolutions declaring that we were loyal to the crown still, but expected rights as English subjects, primarily the right to not be taxed without representation. That only led to the Declaratory Act in 1766, establishing Parliament's right to do whatever they liked in the colonies. Further acts followed, culminating in the Tea Act and the Tea Party, that caused the Intolerable Acts, that pushed through Parliament and the colonies to establish the First Continental Congress in Philadelphia in 1774. The paper then moves more specifically to Virginia, focusing on the events leading up to the proclamation. At nearly the same time, and for the same reasons, General Gage and Lord Dunmore led raids against gunpowder stores that resulted in the Battle of Lexington and Concord in Massachusetts, and in Virginia, the theft of the gunpowder from the Williamsburg magazine. Both actions were promoted by Lord Dartmouth, who wanted to disarm the rebels. Virginians did not take kindly to Lord Dunmore's repression, and the tension grew and grew in the colony until it pushed him to the safety of the Royal Navy, where he used the Navy to raid plantations, plundering and stealing slaves. The animosity to Lord Dunmore was growing, and both Washington and Jefferson sent letters to their wives, warning them that Lord Dunmore might try to capture them. The success of the Navy and some skirmishes, especially the one at Kemp's Landing in November, gave Lord Dunmore the confidence to make his proclamation that established martial law and offered freedom to able-bodied slaves willing to fight. This was a turning point in the ideals of the Virginians and of the Continentals. Slave revolts put fear into whites everywhere in the South, and even though it is estimated that fewer than 1% of enslaved Virginians were able to kill whites in the 18th century, it is likely that by 1760, nearly every white person in the eastern counties knew a free person who had been murdered by a slave. To evaluate the mindset of the whites from Virginia before and after the proclamation, I include excerpts from famous Virginians George Washington, Richard Henry Lee, and Thomas Jefferson. The mood of the letters is all very similar. They all desire to stay in the empire before the war started and continued to hold out hope that they would stay in the empire into 1775. But the actions of Lord Dunmore will, in the words of Washington, make him the most formidable enemy America has. Yet what was the mood of the slaves and freemen in Virginia and elsewhere in the colonies? The Revolutionary War itself put slaveholders and slaves in an interesting predicament. On the one hand, a war like the Revolutionary War could only be won if all members of the community were pitching in, including the slaves. Freedom was an obvious way to ensure black loyalty to the rebellion, but in the southern colonies especially, slavery was paramount to their financial success, regardless of the outcome of the war. Lord Dunmore moved first on this, trying to recruit the slaves and hinder the Virginians' ability to not only fight the war, but to sustain itself. Free blacks, however, were already serving in the Continental Army at the time. Washington had to call a council of war to decide whether to keep those blacks in the army and to allow further enlistments. His war council advised against it, as did Congress. But the success of Lord Dunmore and the enthusiasm of the blacks all throughout the colonies changed his mind just weeks after his original denial of black enlistments. This reversal of heart by Washington changed the flow of excitement among blacks from going to the British flag to enlisting in the Continental Army. And most colonies after that passed laws to encourage slave enlistments, with handsome payouts to their masters for their freedom after the war was over. So Lord Dunmore's proclamation on November 7th, 1775 was a wake-up call to the colonials. Virginians and other southern colonies were dealing with slave revolts and threats to turn slaves against their masters for years before the Revolutionary War. And Lord Dunmore's attempt to use that fear and the labor of those slaves, able to fight to turn the tide of the war in the South for the British, was miscalculated, and he underestimated the resolve of both whites and blacks in Virginia and elsewhere in the colonies. Without a doubt, slavery and racial injustice was an issue at this time, but blacks, both free and slaves, found ways to make their desire for freedom heard. And through the efforts of men like Washington, they were eventually able to serve in the Continental Army and fight for their freedom alongside whites as equals. Lord Dunmore's folly was not in making his proclamation, it was in the execution thereof. He selfishly only offered freedom to those able to fight, which disenfranchised blacks who had families and loved ones who needed their freedom as well. It is unlikely that this proclamation or any small change to it would have significantly changed the course of the war, but it is an interesting case study in the use of slavery as a tool in war and politics. Thanks for watching. I look forward to your videos.